All right. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first keynote of today, which will be given by Judith Verstegen. And Judith graduated in geoinformation sciences and remote sensing, and later did her PhD on the topic of land use change models and uncertainty quantification in this context at Utrecht University. She then was a junior professor at Uni Münster in Germany, and now she's an assistant professor at Utrecht University again, and her main research focus is in geosimulation and spatial optimization. Her talk today will be titled Plea for Pareto Frontiers, and I'm very excited to hear her talk, so the stage is yours.
Thanks for the introduction, Nina. Yeah, welcome everyone to my presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, spatial optimization, which is quite an old technique, but why that is relevant now, especially in the context of the global challenges that we're facing. And then I will explain how Pareto fronts are related to spatial optimization, and then I will come to 4 open challenges that we are currently facing. And these open challenges are: life ain't optimal, space is not an array, solution space may be unanticipated, and a Pareto front is not a line. And for each of these open challenges, I will give an example of one direction in which we are currently working to solve it. But again, they are still open challenges, so I also invite you to contribute to the research. I will start very simply explaining to you what an optimization problem is in the first place, because you may have not thought about that. We encounter spatial optimization problems, or optimization problems in general, on a daily basis, whenever we have to pick a solution from multiple alternatives. What you see here is that we may want to select some suites from the 5 that are presented here. And we use, explicitly or implicitly, criteria to make this decision. Most likely, we will choose what we find the most tasty cake over here. But we may also have other objectives. Namely, we may also want to select one with low costs if we have a limited budget. That means, as you can see already here, that often in taking decisions, we have multiple objectives. So what is an optimization problem? Well, you can say that an optimization problem consists of 3 main components always. You have 1 or more objectives expressed as functions, and they represent what should be maximized or minimized. Then you have 1 or more control variables, sometimes called decision variables, and they represent what you can change or what you can control, or what the policymaker can control in the system. Then, often but not always, there are also constraints, and constraints, they specify infeasible or undesirable system configurations. So basically, solutions that are impossible. If you want to solve such optimization problem, computationally, we use algorithms to do that. And these algorithms can either be exact solvers or heuristics, as was already explained in the previous session. And such optimization algorithm yields 2 main things: the optimal solutions and the corresponding optimal objective function values. So how good these solutions perform. Now, why is this relevant? Why are these techniques relevant in the context of global challenges? Here you see something that you have seen many times before, probably, some pictures of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals express what we want to reach in the current decade, such as no poverty, 0 hunger, and to save life on land. Now, some of these Sustainable Development Goals, they have synergies between them, such as this one here. If we want to build more industry and improve our infrastructure, there's a synergy with creating work and economic growth, because such projects, they create work opportunities. However, there are also many trade-offs between these sustainable development goals. For example, we may want to reach zero hunger, and therefore we need to expand our croplands, but that may go at the cost of natural vegetation and therefore decrease life on land. And what is important when talking about these sustainable development goals is that we can basically quantify these trade-offs, because then we can make informed decisions about how to organize space in the best way. Now, where do Pareto fronts come into play? Well, Pareto fronts are basically the quantification of these trade-offs. If you have two objectives that conflict with each other, as you see here in this picture, for example, here in this example, costs and information. This is a paper that is about experimental design. So how many experiments should you perform? If you perform a lot of experiments, you gain a lot of information, but it's also very costly. So in principle, we would like to minimize costs, but maximize the amount of information that we get from these experiments. And we can plot all optimal solutions. We can plot all solutions from the optimization algorithm in this space, so between these two objectives. And you see that here in the orange squares and the blue circles. And all solutions that are optimal, they together form the Pareto front. That means that we cannot improve in one objective without making the other one worse. So we cannot gain more information without increasing the cost. And so these together form this line, and that's the Pareto front. And now why do these quantify the trade-offs? Well, because they say, if we want to increase our information by 20%, we will have an increasing cost of 10%, for example. So the steepness of the line is the trade-off that we have. And we can do the same with our sustainable development goals for a certain location in a certain time frame. Now, in spatial optimization, one or more of the decision variables are spatially explicit. So here you see an example of a spatial optimization problem. In A, we see 3 cities, and these cities, they have inhabitants, and the inhabitants, they want to eat. So we cultivate crops, and we need to transport these crops to the cities. What we could do is to optimize the transportation distances, so to minimize the distances. And then we get the situation in B, that some of the croplands need to be transported to a different city in order to achieve this minimization. We could also have multiple control variables, for example, change what is cultivated, or even change the diet of the inhabitants, and then the optimization problem becomes more complicated. Now, if your decision variable is spatial, that means that also the solutions that you obtain are spatial. So each point on the Pareto front is basically a spatial configuration. That's what you see here. That means that the whole decision space that we have is in itself spatial. So now I come to the interesting part, that is these 4 challenges that we are working on. And the first one is life ain't optimal. So here you see a Pareto front between 2 goals, so 2 objectives. On the one hand, for this synthetic case study, we want to decrease the economic costs of some solution. And on the other hand, we want to decrease or minimize the environmental impacts of the solution. Now, we may have this Pareto front as an output, and we can look at 2 different solutions on the Pareto front. But how can we choose between them? What we should ask ourselves is it realistic to reach these solutions given the current trends that we have in this system? And that's basically a question that spatial optimization cannot answer. Why can it not answer that? Because there's no process knowledge involved. You're just configuring things in space with a heuristic. Then on the other hand, as a potential solution, we could use geosimulation models, which is my other expertise. What's a geosimulation model? It's a computational representation of a system and all the processes that are in that system. And geosimulation models are traditionally run for different scenarios. So here you see a run for scenario A and a scenario B. One could be a business as usual scenario, and the other one is one where you implement a certain intervention. That's scenario B, so we have higher costs, but then we lower the impacts. But what a geosimulation model cannot answer is whether that gray point that you see over there is actually reachable. Why can we not answer that? Because we only know these 2 points in the solution space, and we don't know anything about the rest of the solution space. So what would be ideal is to combine these two approaches, because then we can cover for the weaknesses of both approaches. Because the Pareto front tells us that the gray point is not reachable. Why not? Because it's below the Pareto front. The Pareto front are the optimal solutions, so below that nothing is possible. And on the other hand, the geosimulation model informs the spatial optimization that the point on the left top seems more realistic to reach, because there's actually a business as usual scenario quite close to it, both in objective and solution space. So it's close, but it also the spatial configuration looks quite similar, so it wouldn't be too difficult to design a policy to steer the system into that direction. So basically the combination of the two approaches is a kind of solution for the fact that life ain't optimal and that optimization doesn't cover that. Here you see an example of an implementation of this approach. So what we did here is we had we looked at ethanol production in the state Goiás in Brazil for 2030, and we tried to optimize both the production costs of the ethanol and minimize the greenhouse gas emissions. And then we get the Pareto front that you see there in black, and we ran a geosimulation model with a business as usual scenario, and then we end up at this black cross. And what's interesting is that, so we can derive a couple of things from this. One thing to note is that the left-hand side of the Pareto front is quite steep. That tells us that it's relatively easy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without increasing the costs a lot. And the cross tells us that the current trends already bring us to a place in the solution space that has relatively low emissions. So we do not need to steer too much to get lower emissions. But what we could do is still steer it to get lower emissions without increasing the cost. So that's what's indicated by this vertical line, for example. So in this way, this picture can basically inform decision-making about what can be done. We can also look at the spatial configurations that belong to these solutions. So here you see on the bottom right the result of the geosimulation model. And what you see here is in the black stars where the ethanol production mills are placed, and the colored grid cells are the sugarcane fields that surround this mill and that deliver to this mill. And the other three maps, they indicate different solutions on the Pareto front. And what we can see is that there are some places, some relatively optimal locations for production that are already automatically picked by the system itself. So for example, the production in the southwest of Goiás is already there, but maybe we could design policies to also stimulate production in the southeast, because that's optimal in all of these cases at the Pareto front, but not yet done as the system is currently designed. A second challenge is that space is not an array. So we should realize that the heuristics that we use to solve spatial optimization problems, they are designed by computer scientists. And computer scientists didn't take into account that we're using spatial data. And that may be a problem for the characteristics that these optimization algorithms have. For example, here you see how a solution may be encoded with a genetic algorithm for the example that I was presenting on the previous slide. So here our genetic algorithm should know that we have an ethanol mill placed at two locations here in space, namely in the cell with index 2 and the cell with index 7. In a genetic algorithm, you flatten this as an array, because that's how genetic algorithms work, that these chromosomes are then exchanged and that they are mutated in terms of the genes. So here you see that on the right-hand side. However, if we now do crossover with this solution, that may work. So it yields, again, two new variations of spatial configurations. However, it doesn't take into account that in reality, the cell with index 2 and index 5 are actually close to each other. And the whole idea behind genetic algorithms is that it keeps together things that belong together, because the idea is that you make two solutions that perform well into one solution that performs better, the child. And if you don't take these spatial relations into account, the algorithm may not work as expected. So a partial solution may be to not use cell indices for as the decision variable, but to use the x and y coordinates of the males. So then at least you have x and y next to each other when they belong to each other. And also you use the property of genetic algorithms that you can make small and large jumps in space by changing the bit at the end or at the beginning of the coordinate. However, this is still not a perfect solution, because this flattened array still doesn't really represent Euclidean space. Another solution that other researchers use is to join first patches together of a similar land use type. That's what's done here by Strauch et al. So here they optimize a land use map, and they say, okay, everything that is together as one forest patch, we put that as one item in our bit string, and then we always mutate or do crossover with the whole thing together. But also this is basically only a partial solution. So it would look like this, that if you change, if you mutate the bit with patch ID 4, then this whole group of forest cells change into cropland in this case. A third challenge that I would like to address here is that solution space may be unanticipated. So here you see again the figure that I was presenting before. On the left-hand side, geosimulation. What is common, as I said already, in geosimulation is to use scenarios in order to inform policymakers. So typically, when we design a study, we use 3 or 4 or 5 scenarios to represent all future possibilities. So basically to represent the whole future solution space. However, we don't really know if A and B represent the whole solution space. And we already partly solved this by saying, okay, but we can look at the Pareto front, then at least we know if the point in gray there is reachable or not, and we concluded that it was not. However, it's also interesting to know if this other point in gray that appeared here now is a possibility. So obviously that's a point that we don't want to reach because it has very high economic costs and very high environmental impacts. So it's not in any way optimal. However, we still should know if in terms of policy making, we should consider this risk or not. Is it a possibility that we should account for or not? And the Pareto front doesn't answer that because the Pareto front only encloses one side of the solution space, namely the optimal side of the solution space. So in this research with Patrick Steinman, a PhD student from Wageningen University, we were trying out a solution for this. And we demonstrate this solution with a very simple geosimulation model, that's Schelling segregation model. For those who don't know, Schelling segregation model is basically an agent-based model that simulates segregation in a city. Each agent is a city that belongs to one of two groups, in this case, the kind of coppered color and the silvered colored groups. And the rules that these agents are governed by are that they stay in the place where they are living when they're happy, and they're happy when at least 1/3 of their neighbors is of the same type as themselves. When they're unhappy, they move to a random empty location somewhere in the grid. And when you run this model for a certain period of time, you see that your city segregates. So you get two groups on two sides of the city. So what we do with this simulation model is to test a certain method, and we test a method to try to find scenarios that are as diverse as possible from each other, so to basically cover the whole solution space that we may have with this model. And we compare our method with 3 existing methods to find scenarios. Very shortly, these 3 methods consist of, first of all, selecting diverse points in the parameter space. So I minimize my first parameter and maximize also with the second one. That's what you see on the left with the purple squares. Another method is to find clusters in your output space and put your scenarios there where they cluster most. And the third one is to find solutions in your solution space at 4 different points. And we compare that with our method, and our method is to not construct only one Pareto front, but both Pareto fronts, such that we know the whole hull around the Pareto, around the solution space, and then select the 4 points there that are furthest away from each other. And here I say 4 because we tested for finding 4 scenarios, but this is something that's flexible. We could also select 3 or 5, doesn't matter. So here in red, you see the solutions that we find. Now here we are comparing the scenario runs for this model. On top you see our method, and indeed what we can observe is that the different solutions, they look also spatially quite different from each other. The first one has large patches that are connected. The second one is very full, a very full city, but with smaller patches. And the third and the fourth, they are both they have a lower density, but the fourth one has somewhere one large patch. And so you also see on the left-hand side the Pareto front that we used in order to find these solutions. And when we compare to other methods, we see that in other methods, they actually select parts of the Pareto, parts of the solution space that are not reachable at all. For example, what you see here in the black circle. Or they select solutions that are quite similar to each other, and that's not good for decision making, because why would you need 2 scenarios that are the same? That doesn't give you any additional information. We also find solutions that were basically unanticipated by any of the other methods. So here's a solution with a very high number of patches that wasn't found by any of the other methods. I won't go into detail of into this slide, but we also used metrics to compare them, and we see that our solutions are more diverse, plausible, and comprehensive. The fourth and last challenge that I want to address is that a Pareto front is not a line, if you think about it. Namely, the spatial data that we use as an input for the spatial optimization, these data are uncertain. We know that from many other domains, so in spatial temporal modeling or simulation modeling, how you want to call it, this is a known fact, and methods have been developed for years to address that. Basically, you can do error propagation to see what the effects is of the uncertainty in this data on the result of your simulation model. You can do that with, for example, Monte Carlo simulation. So in theory, you might say, well, we can also do a Monte Carlo simulation on our optimization approaches. However, the heuristic optimization algorithms that we use for most spatial optimization problems, they are already computationally very costly, because many of them are about having a population of solutions, for example, as you have with genetic algorithms. And so to do an additional loop of Monte Carlo around that would blow up your problem, basically. So in this research with my PhD student Moritz Hildeman, we looked at a method to still find what the uncertainty is around our Pareto front. So on the right-hand side, you see basically what we're looking for. We're looking for not only a front, but also the uncertainty band around it, so that it basically becomes a Pareto interval, that we don't really know what the optimal solution is within that range. And we did that in the following way. It's not so easy to do that by looking at the whole optimization problem, because the different objectives, they interact with each other. However, when you go to the very extremes, namely at the point where only objective 1 or only objective 2 is of relevance, then it is actually possible to say what the uncertainty, or easier to say what the uncertainty band is, because at that point of your Pareto front, it's a single objective optimization problem. You say, okay, 100% of my optimization, I focuses on objective 1 or objective 2. And what you can then do is to either solve that problem analytically, or you can basically reason what the optimal solution is. And in order to illustrate that, I will tell you what the optimization problem is that we were looking at here. It's a synthetic land use optimization problem. And some of them, so we had 4 objectives. And one of these objectives was to maximize crop yield. Crop yield, this objective has 2 spatial data inputs, namely the land use map to see where the crops are, and the potential yield map. Now, this potential yield map, it contains uncertainty, because that's a map that is constructed globally by the IASA. It takes into account the climate zone, the precipitation, etc. So that these are things that are uncertain. So your potential yield has basically a mean and a standard deviation. So what we can do is we can say, okay, for this particular objective, what would be the yield map, the potential yield map that gives us the highest potential maximum yield or the lowest potential maximum yield. Terminology is a bit difficult to understand, but this gives you the 2 points that you see on the right in green and red. So for one objective, we can determine the band. And what we do is we solve then the optimization problem with the 2 potential yield maps that belong to this point, and then we get the whole Pareto interval instead of the Pareto line front. And what can you do with that? Well, you can, of course, look at the uncertainty range itself for the objectives. That's already interesting, but more interesting is to look at the corresponding solutions. So here you see in black the solution that belongs to the median, in green to the maximum, and in red to the minimum of that interval. And what's interesting for decision makers is whether these maps are similar or not. So if these maps, in terms of their land use, in terms of their optimal land use configurations, are very similar, then the uncertainty doesn't really impact the decision making. Namely, the decision makers should always still steer the system to this same land use configuration, irrespective of the uncertainty. However, if they're very different, then the uncertainty becomes more problematic, because then you also don't know, because of this uncertainty, what really the optimal land use configuration is that you should go for. So to wrap up, what I tried to show you here is that spatial optimization is still a very relevant technique in geoscience, and that it's especially interesting to make more use of Pareto fronts in the context of the global challenges that relate to conflicting claims for space, because they can help us to quantify trade-offs between different goals that we have. You should, if possible, do that in combination with geosimulation, because life ain't optimal. Geosimulation helps you to say whether any solution on that Pareto front is actually realistic to obtain given the processes that are currently happening in the system. You should also think about the algorithmic properties, because the algorithms are developed by computer scientists, and computer scientists didn't think about the properties of spatial data. So the algorithms aren't designed to deal with spatial data, and you shouldn't just apply them without thinking about these consequences, because space isn't not an array. You should also think about the open ends of your Pareto front, so basically the worst solutions, because the worst solutions are things that we should avoid in this world. So we should also think about them and see that they are risks. So for that, you could possibly use 2 Pareto fronts, namely also not optimize, but to do the reverse. If you, in theory, want to minimize something, then maximize it to see what is the worst possible case that you should account for. And finally, we should think about uncertainties, because as we know from other methods in geoscience, uncertainty impacts the results of our methods. So in the end, a Pareto front is not a line, but it's an interval, and this interval may influence your optimal decisions. Thanks a lot. I'm really curious to hear your questions now.